Leadership and Small Business Education and Entrepreneurial Development Office that oversees the REACH program. My co-presenter is Dr. Steve Wolpe, another one of our EIRs. Between us, we have founded, co-founded, invested in, and evaluated lots of startup companies, and we'll try to share some of the lessons learned in that regard to the topic of whether, when, and how to start a new life sciences company. So I don't see more people piling in. So in the interest of time, we'll just go ahead and get started. Go to the next slide, please, Katie. A couple disclaimers and housekeeping points. The following is obviously informational content, hopefully for educational purposes. But if you want to start a company, there is no substitute for engaging a good corporate attorney. We're not here to dispense legal advice, either writ large or at an individual situation. The current presentation is aimed to provide background and hopefully to spark more dialogue over time so that you can properly engage counsel on, and it's counsel with an SEL, apologies for the typo. There. A couple other housekeeping arrangements. This presentation will be recorded and the slides also made available in a week or so. So no needs to take furious notes and or if you have colleagues in your institutions or areas that couldn't make this particular hour, they will be able to see this recorded. We will take questions at the end for sure. We have an hour blocked. We're aiming to present for 35 minutes or so and then leave ample time for questions. For the questions, up at the top of the screen, on my screen is the fourth icon from the left is the Q&A button. That's how we'll be submitting questions. They'll be moderated, screened, and in some cases grouped, or because sometimes you have 2-3 people with a similar question grouped for presentation to us. We may get 1 or 2 if there's something that we're just unclear on. We'll get interruptions, but by and large, we're going to try to present first and do Q&A later. So with that, I think we're ready to start the meat of the presentation, Katie. So what are we going to talk about today? Why, whether, when, and how to start new life science companies. We're going to start with the why. Why start a company at all? There's lots of ways of doing research. There's lots of ways of contributing to medical progress. Why start a company? And what's the difference between starting a company and licensing a technology? Whether, is it to, that trigger point of the world needs this, the research you need to do on the market needs, the scope, mission, and name of the company. When, this is very important, securing access, presumably exclusively, to core IP, to me is a absolutely necessary prerequisite. You don't have a company in the biosciences space if you don't have exclusive IP. But there's also the when and what to trigger and where to incorporate, and then delineating the founders, their roles, including the ability to fully dedicate their professional effort. For many people, starting a company should represent a fork in the road. I will do A or B. You can't have it all. We'll discuss that a little bit too. And then the how. What type of company to form? There are lots of different legal structures. What are the pros and cons? How do you allocate equity among the founders? How do you set aside equity for the people you're going to need to recruit along the way, both as workers and as investors, and then the sources of capital. You'll know what FFF means by the end of this presentation. Grants, accelerators, lots of other sources of funding as well. Go to the next slide, Katie. Thank you. So, reality check. Once you start a company, you're no longer in science, you're now in sales. I credit my colleague Steve for that quote. And it is one of those fork in the roads of, am I primarily a scientist or am I now a commercial person? And if you're starting a company, it's because it's a commercial enterprise. You were trained as a scientist, you have the knowledge of a scientist, you may still be doing science, but your overarching goal is getting a commercial product on the market that can be used clinically in hopefully millions of patients. So I said market. That is critical to starting a company. What's the customer analysis? Who's going to buy this product? How big is that market? How many of such people are there? The competitive, what's the available set of solutions that are out there today, and why are they going to buy yours instead of somebody else's? These are critical market-driven questions rather than scientifically driven questions that are critical to there being the viability of a company. If you're going to have a company, there is yet to be a model where you give everything away for free. Somebody has to pay, or somebody has to monetize in some way. Even so-called free apps are really driven by data capture and or advertising. So there's always some economic exchange going on. What's the risk-benefit analysis? What will your product be safe? Will it be affordable? Pharmacoeconomic analysis. Will your product save money for patients, providers, and or payers? Some audience has to come out ahead, who is essential to the economic exchange for a product to be viable in today's analysis. And then protection, IP analysis and or other exclusivity. Can you protect yourself against competition? Lots of people have other clever ideas, and pretty much any good idea can be knocked off. How are you going to ensure that they're buying your product rather than somebody else's? Next slide, please, Katie. So what I've laid out here on a left to right continuum is sort of, from the beginning to what's the end in mind. So at the beginning, you need to define your scope of your company. What is, and what, just as importantly, what is not within the research and commercial scope of the intended company. And to the extent you're working with co-founders, which is probably the norm actually in life sciences, getting a commonality of purpose about these are the things that are going to exist within the company that we are going to do together. And by definition, what is not in that set that we won't be spending time on, or at least won't be spending the company's time and effort on. Critical to have some boundaries, because otherwise you can quickly kind of lose focus and get nothing done rather than getting one thing done. Once you figure out the scope, we're going to be the company that does X and not doing Y or Z. Name. You're gonna have to, one of the earliest decisions you're gonna have to make, even if it's just as a placeholder, you got to give the company a name. You can't, it's like a baby. Once they're born, you can't get a birth certificate until you come up with a name. They won't let you out of the hospital without one. So checking the availability of trademarks, web domains, etc., are critical. Are you going to get it right the first time? Hopefully, but not always. And it can and often is changed later. But you got to start with a name, and you save yourself a lot of heartache if you do some preliminary trademark searches, naming conventions in multiple languages kind of search, and domain searching up front. Because these days, without that, you don't really exist if you don't exist in cyberspace. Third is the mission. Are we a pharmaceutical development company, a device company, a diagnostic company, which isn't listed, or a services company? Are we making a tangible product, or are we providing effort towards some activity that has a salutary effect on health? That has implications for what kind of company you form, how you make your money, and the capital intensity of the development effort does have some implications for how, really at the early stage of what kind of filing documents do you have. And we'll be talking about that a little bit more later in the presentation. The model here, it's a fork in the road. Are we a product development company or a services company? Investors hate the mixed model. There's a certain elegance of, well, we'll do some services as a way of paying the bills while we work on our product. The problem with that is that you're going to, on the service side, you're going to be competing with service providers who are 100% focused on service. So chances are you're going to be losing service business if you're not fully dedicated to it. And B, your product development business doesn't get your full attention if in fact you're spending your time on services. So early advice, and I know that a lot of scientific enterprises look at it, you're not going to get to the next one, which is exit. How do you plan to grow and expand the company as an independent entity so that it can eventually be either acquired or go public? Ultimately, any company has to reach one of three endpoints. It gets acquired, in which case the founders and the investors get paid. It goes public, which is an opportunity for those who want to liquidate can. The others can stay. I guess it can stay a private company, but then only the founders ever make money there, and like a family business, et cetera. It's very tough to recruit outside talent and impossible to recruit outside investment because they're never going to get a return. I guess the fourth outcome, sadly, is bankruptcy. So next slide. And that's not the one you want to have in mind. I talked a lot about a key kind of decision point about whether to start a company is, have you secured IP? Basically, the lack of exclusivity eviscerates commercial value. If you're not the only game in town for being able to provide this product, it's almost impossible to invest in, because the minute you're successful, others will come in. There's not much in the way of a first mover advantage there. That said, there are many different ways of protecting intellectual property. You can file patents. You can go the trade secret route. I only recently learned, and I know this isn't a healthcare product, that the lubricant WD-40 is not protected by any patents. They did like Coca-Cola, and the formula is a trade secret. And it's good enough and sufficiently superior to other lubricants that people still buy WD-40, even though it's strictly a secret formula. It's not patented. It's not common to go the trade secret route in biotech and medtech, so most people do go the patent route. Then, of course, there are copyrights and trademarks. This has to do with name, logo, verbiage, etc. And then the geographic scope is huge. Everybody starts in, when I say everybody, I'm talking to an NIH oriented audience. Everyone on this call is living and working in the US. But the US is the largest single market for most biotech and medtech products. But you need to have at least Western Europe, Japan, the developed world covered in your IP as well at some point over time, and you are well advised. Your value of your company goes up with the geographic scope with which you've protected your IP. With that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Wolpe, to take it from here.
Yeah, so thanks, Louis. So let me just back up one minute. Louis is just throwing a lot of stuff at you. I'm going to throw some more stuff, and I don't want you to get intimidated by everything. It's a very different process starting a business than what you're used to in academics. And I went through that. I started out as a postdoc. I had some discoveries that were relevant for industry, and I was recruited to industry. And it's a real mind change. So don't let all of this throw you. Louis at the beginning said that it would be helpful to have a good lawyer to help you. It also would be helpful to have a good business person. Your tech transfer office at your university can help, but having an experienced business person that you can call on and really ask these questions, and maybe that person is at the business school in your university or just someone you know. But there's a lot of angles, as Luis just mentioned, in setting up a company, and someone who's been there and done that is really helpful in getting you acclimated to what's a business climate as opposed to an academic one. So in terms of at what point does it make sense to set up a company, there's multiple answers to that. A large part of that is driven by personal interests. If your interest really is just doing research and producing publications and working on academic questions, and don't start a company. It's, let your postdoc or let somebody else start the company. But if you're interested in going beyond publications and actually developing a product that ultimately could be used in the clinic and help patients, then I think at that point it makes sense to start a company. In the current environment, it also helps to have a company because it gives you access to additional funding beyond the current academic grants. So Luis mentioned that we're in the seed office. They run the SBIR, um, which are grants specifically for companies. If you, as an academic, spin out a company, that company can do sponsored research in your lab. You can set up an SBIR, an STTR, and have another source of money for your research. You also, if the company gets investors, then that company can again set up sponsored research agreements with your lab, and that's another source of funding for the work that's done in the lab. And then finally, to what Luis had mentioned earlier, it doesn't make sense to set up a company unless you have a competitive advantage. So any of you who watch Shark Tank and see Mr. Wonderful talk about people who don't have a patent getting crushed like a bug by the big companies, that's exactly the same in biotech. If you don't have a strong patent position, then investors won't invest, and you're not going to be able to stave off competition. So all of those really need to come together before you decide to start a company. And then the question is, what type of company? Is it a brick and mortar company, meaning it has a building, it has offices, it has real estate, or virtual? And currently, most biotech startup is virtual because you don't have any money, you don't need the overhead of brick and mortar or labs. It's only really necessary to have that, and a lot of the research can be done by contract manufacturers, contract research organizations, CROs, and contract manufacturers or CDMOs. And generally for a startup biotech, it doesn't make sense to put a lot of money into a building when there's already existing infrastructure that you can access. In terms of site of incorporation versus operations, we need to explain what incorporation means. So when you start a company, you have to incorporate it so it's a legal entity. And there's a process you go through. If it's, as we'll talk about, if it's a simple partnership or LLC, you can do that yourself in a day in your state. Every state has a website you go to. You say, I want to start a company. It's going to be a simple partnership, and you fill out the form, and boom, you're a company. As we'll talk about in a minute, if you're going to start a biotech that requires investment or that's going to develop a product, then you want to form what's called a C Corp, and then the site of where you incorporate becomes an issue. So the standard until very recently has always been that a startup company that's looking for investment and that is producing a product incorporates as a Delaware C Corp. Yeah, we'll explain the difference between LLCs and C Corps in a minute. More recently, spurred on by Elon Musk, who got fed up with some of the Delaware specific issues. People have started to incorporate in Nevada, Wyoming, South Dakota. Another thing to take into account, and there's different tax advantages for each. The Delaware system was renowned because it has a specific court system for companies called the Chancery Court. And almost every major company you've heard of, GE, Coca-Cola, lots of international companies are Delaware C Corps, primarily because of the Chancery system and also the tax advantages. Some states have, and we're located in Maryland. Maryland has, some of the counties will match if you get an SBIR. So that adds additional revenue, and they do that to try and spur company formation in their state in order to eventually grow companies and have employees and increase their tax base. So there's states that are starting to do that, and the choice of the state really depends on where you're located and the relative tax advantages. The other question is, how do you set up who's going to be the people who run the company? So a lot of academics start out as CEOs, and that becomes problematic. And your technology best. You may have one of your postdocs be an employee, but it becomes a bit problematic when you start to raise funding because you're not 100% devoted to the company. You're mostly running your lab in the university. That's your primary affiliation, and investors want somebody who's fully dedicated to the company. So at some point, even if you start a company, you should try and hire a business person who can lead the company and attract investors. And most often that's somebody who has a track record. Investors look for someone who's been there and done that. In addition to the management of the company, which is the CEO, you want a CFO who can help raise funds and look after the finances, and the COO or chief operating officer who can make sure that things get done on time. You also need a board of directors. Then the board of directors has the fiduciary responsibility of overseeing the company and making sure that everything is done legally and making the ultimate decisions for the company. And you'll also want a scientific advisory board. And often what you try and do is get people who are what are called KOLs, or key opinion leaders, people who are known in the field that investors will recognize their names and want to invest in the company, and also who can give you good scientific advice. So on the next slide, touched on this a little bit earlier. There's multiple, when you talk about a company, there's multiple legal entities that you can form. One are just simple partnerships called LLCs or LLPs, or sole proprietorship if you're the owner. And if you have a service company, these are perfectly fine. You're going to be selling a service. These are what are called pass-through corporations, where it just goes on your personal taxes. It's not very complicated. But these aren't entities that you would set up if you want an investor. If you want an investor, most likely what you want to do is set up a C Corp. That's what all investors are used to. They know how to deal with that. They know the tax advantages. And from your viewpoint, which a lot of people aren't aware of, there's the 1202 tax exemption. What the 1202 tax exemption says, it was set up by IRS in order to spur the formation of corporations. And if you start a company and you hold the stock in that company for 5 years, or if you're an early investor in that company and you hold the stock for 5 years, and then you sell the company for $100 million, the first $10 million of that is tax-free. It doesn't have to be 100 million, whatever you sell it for. The first, and it varies year by year, but generally it's around $10 million. You and the other founders and investors get that first $10 million tax-free. But that only applies to a C Corp. So you'll hear a lot of people, especially on the East Coast, argue about whether you should start as an LLC and switch to a C Corp when you're ready to invest. It really doesn't make sense to do that. You should just start as a C Corp, because why spend 2 or 3 years as an LLC and not have that count towards your 5-year 1202 exemption? It's better just to start as a C Corp from the beginning, even if it's a little more complicated, and have that time accrued to the 1202 tax exemption. And again, these are all things that we're throwing at you, but talk to a tax attorney or a business person who can really explain it. All right, on the next slide. So as I said, for services, it's simple. Pass-through corporation is fine. That's if you just plan on selling your services. Let's say you're an AI company and you have software and you're just going to license out your software and you don't really need investment. It's perfectly fine to do it as an LLC or sole proprietorship. S corp is sort of in between the two. It's fine to do it as an S corp. Just talk to a tax attorney for your particular situation, see which of these is best. And then, as I mentioned on the next slide, if you are developing a product, a device, something that you're going to need to bring in investors, and by investors I mean professional investors, not just friends and family, but a VC, an institutional investor, or if you want to partner with a large pharmaceutical company or large business, C corps are what everybody's used to. They understand them. If you go to them as an LLC, they're not going to be very, their attorneys are not going to be very happy setting up collaborations with LLCs. They want to see a C corp. And as we mentioned, Delaware C corp is really currently the standard. So that's okay. Go ahead to the next slide. So then once you set up your company, what percentage of the company do you own? Usually if you're an academic and you're spinning out a company, you started as a sole proprietorship. So you'll start a C corp and you'll own 100% of the stock. And then what you want to do is you'll license the technology from your university. The university will say, well, we want a part of the company. So they'll often take a percentage of your company. So now you're no longer at 100%, let's say you're at 95%. And then you may want to hire employees. And so you start what's called a stock option agreement, and you set aside maybe 10% of your stock for employees, and they get stock options in your company. When you do that, when you first incorporate the company, it's not worth anything. It's just a company on paper. And so usually what you'll see is that every share in the company, and when you start the company, they'll start with, let's say, 10 million shares. They just take an arbitrary number and say, here's how many shares you're going to have. And each of those shares will be like 0.0001% in value. Once you license in the patent, then the valuation of the company goes up. And once you bring in money, the valuation goes up. But what also happens is your percent of the company goes down, and that's called dilution. So let's say you have a company that's worth, on paper, $10 million, and you bring in an investor and they put in $10 million into your company. The pre-money value of that company is 10 million. The post value is 20 million. So that investor who put in 10 gets 50% of your company, right? 10 million out of 20 million. And you get diluted by 50%. So you no longer own 100%, you now own 50%, but you own 50% of a company worth 20 million as opposed to 100% of a company worth 10 million. So you need to understand dilution. That's where grants are really important and what are called non-dilutive funding. So NIH, when it writes, it gives you a grant, it doesn't ask for equity in your company, and that's called non-dilutive funding. If you bring in money from investors, they want a piece of your company, and that's when you get diluted. So understanding dilution and non-dilution is very important in terms of your company. And the other thing that I skipped is when your company is worth only 0.0001%, 1 penny per share, you want to do what's called an 83B declaration, and your lawyer can explain that. But basically, you just tell the IRS, here's the valuation of my company, and then you don't have to pay tax when all of a sudden your valuation goes up to 10 million or 20 million until until you actually sell your stock. So talk to a lawyer about 83B declaration when you first form your company. All right, next.
One other point, Steve, before we move on.
Sure.
Go back, Katie, is Steve ran through the example of the single founder, and that's very true. You often have a multi-founder situation from the get-go. And those first bullet points are of how to divide, and often we get called in as the IRs to at least provide some advice. How do you divide up the initial equity when there are multiple co-founders. And I think a key guidance is sort of who had the idea or the ideas, and that's certainly worth some allocation. Who's going to actually work to turn those into a business, including coming to that fork in the road and saying, I'm going to be doing this full time. You guys keep your academic day jobs. That gets the major allocation. And so it is a related topic to dilution, and that at the beginning, those who are opting in to do the work for what could easily be a 5 to 10 year slog before it becomes a product, they get the bulk of the, because it's really the allocations about the value that's going to get created. Steve just noted at the beginning, as of the incorporation date, the shares are worth some tiny fraction of a penny. They're worthless, which is why you want to do the 83 of B election, because then you're getting taxed on income of essentially zero. But it's really about the future, and you think about the founder shares in terms of what are you signing up for in terms of the proportional effort on a go-forward basis. So that was the point I wanted to make there.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And to follow up on that, the other side of it is if you do hire a CEO and they do get a good chunk of your company, you don't want them to say thank you very much and then walk away. So usually those shares are vested, which means, let's say you give them 10% of your company. You don't just give them 10% right at the beginning, but you offer them 10% that vest over time. So let's say they vest over 5 years. That means they get 2% every year, and that's an incentive for them to stay with the company and build it, rather than just take the shares and go somewhere else. So again, these are all things that you'll learn as you start the company. It's not, it's a lot to take in a 1-hour seminar, but just find people who can work with you and explain these things as you go along. All right, so the next slide. We talked about this a little bit earlier. So there's non-dilutive, where the grant or the funders, it could be a nonprofit. It doesn't have to be NIH. There are foundations that will give grants. But those are all really attractive because you don't get dilution of your stock. On the other hand, as you all know, because you're all used to writing grants, you don't always get grants the first time or the second time, and sometimes not the third time. You have to keep after it. And even if you get the grant, it can take a year before the money reaches the bank. And so to get the company going, you usually need to raise capital from investors. And there are different ways of doing that. We won't get into details, except there's a site, there's an incubator called Y Combinator on the West Coast that's famous for having developed a lot of this in the early days of IT and computers. So look up Y Combinator. They developed what's called a safe note, which is basically an agreement between you and the investor, and they've worked out all the terms so that what they found was that investors sometimes would slip in terms into their agreements that founders didn't understand, and ended up really taking a large portion of the company, which wasn't quite fair. So they've come up with safe notes in order to make sure that the agreement is fair to both the investor and the founder. But usually what you start off, we call friends, family, and fools, people who share your dream, people you know, and are willing to invest, 20, 30, 50, maybe if they're wealthy, 100,000, and just to get the company going. And then you bring in angel investors, which are people, usually wealthy individuals, who want to give back or who are interested in the space. If you're doing a diabetes company, maybe they have a family member who has diabetes and they want to invest in your idea. And then you go for the larger money, and there's what are called family offices, which are set up by wealthy families in order to do their investments. There's venture capital, VCs, and there's strategic partnerships, which can be dilutive, or sometimes they're not dilutive. If you can license your technology to pharma, they'll pay you, and you're not getting diluted. So These are all things that as you go along, and this is where sales comes in, right? So you're used as a scientist, many of you are used as scientists to always uh, being really careful about your claims and not making sure everything is evidence-based and putting lots of caveats, and that will kill you if you go to an investor where you say, yeah, this is really good, but it might not work. It's, we have some data, but we don't have this. An investor will just turn around and walk away. You have to actually sell them on your vision. You have to completely change your academic training to that of a salesman, that what you have is the best in the world, and you have to exude confidence, and you're going to make this succeed where no one else can. And it's completely diametrically opposed to everything you've ever been trained as an academic. So that's where the idea that you're no longer in academics, you're now in sales. So I think we can skip this. This is just lots of different ways of raising money. And if you have questions about any of these, we can do it during the Q&A.
Yep.
And then we have additional resources, the Y Combinator that I mentioned, NIH website. We have lots of training modules that you can look at, and other websites where you can find out more about what we discussed.
And now we move into the Q&A portion of, we're right about on the time we expected. We've got a healthy amount of time for questions, and
we have some questions.
All right.
So the anonymous voice from the internet says, when universities take equity in a company, do they invest? Or is that just something they take you for launching from their university?
I'll start, and then in my experience, do they invest? They've invested the fact that IP that they paid for in a lab they paid for with staff they paid for now has value. Are they giving you a check? No, more often than not. To the contrary, they're going to be asking in the license that you cover their IP costs going forward.
Yeah, no, I agree. And generally, it's that when you license from a university, they'll want equity. They also want milestone payments. And the most important thing for the tech transfer office is that they get paid back for all of the costs of their patents. So they've probably filed patents for you, and they want to recoup those costs from the company. That's kind of a sticky question. What you want to make sure when you start the company is, Louis had talked about US versus worldwide coverage. Generally, universities only do US because the tech transfer office gets lots of inventions. They don't know which ones are going to succeed. And the real cost of patents goes up when you start filing internationally, because you have to do translation. So your patent has to be translated into French, German, Korean, Chinese, and that's a very expensive proposition. And a patent can end up costing a couple $1 million to file everywhere and maintain. But from a company point of view, you want it to be covered everywhere, because if you want to ultimately license to pharma, then they want worldwide coverage. So going back to the question of when to start a company, if you think you have something really hot and the university has filed a PCT, you may want to start a company. And PCT is an international filing that then goes to what are called, after PCT, you then go through a national stage where you identify which countries you want to file in. And you may want to start the company as soon as you file a PCT, so that the company can raise money and have you file internationally and really have your invention covered worldwide. So that fits into the whole strategy as well.
Excellent. Our next question is, how do scientists typically find a CEO? I see most people having a former postdoc or grad student, but with clinical medicine, we're mostly working with MDs whose post-grad salary expectations are higher than most startups will tolerate, and have earlier career practice and medical license needs?
Yep. So I'll again start there. The finding a CEO, sometimes it could be one of your angel investors. Having a postdoc is fine early on, but ultimately when you get to the investment stage, asking for professional money. So you've gone through the friends, family, and fools, you've gone through the angel groups, now you're getting into professional investors. They often talk about, betting on the jockey, betting on the horse. In this analogy, the horse is the technology, the jockey is the CEO and the management team. And they're not looking for great scientists. They're looking for people who've done it before, which by definition is not a first-time CEO. It is a CEO who is, as a person who's had leadership roles in pharma and biopharma firms in the past, leading to at least a C-level role, if not a CEO role, and knows intimately the business components of launching this product. Whether the company is going to launch it themselves or is going to partner, you need to be able to really ascertain what's the business case. So that's the kind of person they're looking for. And given that medical technologies tend to have a relatively short market life, right? You launch and whether it's your patent expires and or something better comes along, that's a 5 to 7 year ride, but humans have 35, 40-year careers. You have a supply out there of experienced people who are now, let's say, in their 40s, sometimes 40s, more likely 50s and 60s, who are not yet retired, who are looking for the next technology. They're candidly going back to, they're looking for the next horse to ride. And so how do you find these people? Industry events. They sometimes find you because they're in search mode themselves. You sometimes find them biding their time doing things like serving as an entrepreneur in residence, whether with a university, a local biotech, or a group like Seed.
Yeah, so I'll just add to that a couple of things. First, if I understood the question, the premise is wrong. You don't need an MD or a clinician to be CEO of a company that's developing a clinical product. In fact, you probably don't want that necessarily. What you want is a really good business person, as Lewis said. You can have a chief medical officer who has all of those credentials, but that doesn't need to be the CEO. The purpose of the CEO is really to get out there and raise money. I mean, that's, they'll also direct the course of the company, but that's in response to the board of directors. But you want a CEO who can raise funds. And the other type of person you can look for are people who've not just been there and done that, but made a lot of money doing it. And there are many people who are ex-pharma or ex-biotech who now want to get back and will serve as a fractional CEO or part-time CEO or even full-time, but just aren't expecting a big salary because they've already made their money, but they really like developing new drugs, or they just want another experience. They're bored of retirement and want to start something
new. They don't want
a lot of them will be big pharma people who just like the idea of starting with a small company.
Yeah.
Sorry, Lewis, what were you going to say?
You said they don't want big money. I would argue actually they might, but they know that salary isn't the way to get there. They want 5%, 10% of the equity on $1 billion exit. The math works.
And the other thing that people don't think about that you really need to consider, especially if you're going to have a postdoc be CEO or something, is you're used to being in a university where you have benefits and you have healthcare and you have healthcare for your family. And once you're in a startup company, if you're full-time in a startup, you don't have that anymore. You have to go on Obamacare. You have to pay for all the benefits that you're used to getting from your university. So that's something when you hire a CEO, they need to be aware of, especially if they're your postdoc, that not only aren't they getting a great salary, but they're also losing benefits that they may be used to in their previous position.
You just make that sound so exciting, like everyone should want to jump into that
So,
boat.
yeah, so it's the kind of thing, actually, no, that's actually serious. Biotech, 90% of or greater of startup biotechs fail. So, and a lot of times the ones who succeed have failed 3 or 4 times before, and they learn from their failures. But it's not an easy road to start a biotech. And so it's if you've got exciting technology and you believe in it and you want to develop it, then start a company. But be aware that it's not going to be easy. So that would be my advice: is consider it carefully from both sides.
Very wise, sage advice. Sage advice indeed. We have a couple of more questions, so I'm hoping we can kind of run through them a little more quickly so we can get to most of them. The first question I'd like to just get one of you to respond to is, can you file a PCT internationally if you have already filed in the US, or will it be considered prior art?
So prior art is something that's published. So first of all, you never want to give a public talk, an abstract, a paper before you file your patent. So anything that's out there, and so I know you want this to be quick, but let me just explain what a patent is. So patent is a contract between an inventor and the government, and the inventor says, "I know something nobody else in the world knows," and the government says, "Well, we want you to make that public in order to spur additional innovations, and we'll give you 20 years exclusivity if you're willing to make it public." But once it's public, the government has no need to do that. So anything that's published will be prior art. If you file in the U.S., it's not prior art, but if it's published, then it is prior art. But generally, what you do is you file a PCT first. If you file U.S., that's a good question. Whether you can still file internationally if it hasn't been. Whether you can file a PCT, I'm not sure if you've already filed in the US. You could abandon that file and file a PCT if it hasn't published. But it's not clear to me how that works. You'd have to check with a good patent lawyer. But the main thing is to make sure if you want to file a PCT that you don't have any public disclosure and that your patent hasn't filed.
So Steve, you just mentioned that you should definitely not publish if you think or even put an abstract out there or give a public talk. We have a question. I have a molecule which has strong effect in vitro studies, but I don't have enough money to do in vivo studies unless I publish. What are my options?
Yeah, so again, patents, when I first started with patents, it blew my mind because it's the opposite of everything that you've ever been taught as a researcher. If you have one example, put it in a patent. You don't need to repeat it. You can do what's called hypothetical examples. So you can actually write an example in your patent of how you would use it in vivo. You don't need data. What a patent does is it codifies your ideas. And so get a good patent lawyer. You don't need to have in vivo data to file a patent. You just need to have the idea and you need to describe it well. The other thing a lot of academics do is not understand the whole idea of a provisional application. A provisional application should be written almost as completely as a patent. So I've seen people just throw in a manuscript and call it a provisional. A provisional locks down the date of invention and it needs to be really properly done. So to talk to a patent lawyer if you're going to file a provisional or if you want to file something and then publish. The main thing is to get your idea submitted to the patent office before you publicly disclose it. So if you have in vitro data and you know how to use it in vivo, you can file a patent and then you can go publish, do whatever you want, but just get it filed first.
Excellent. Lewis, maybe you can help us with this next question. What's the give and take of an early board member? Do they invest? Do they offer advice in their networks to grow the company? How does that differ from a scientific advisory board?
Yep. Great question. For starters, your early board is typically driven actually by investment. They are investors, and they're almost expected to help you find other investors on a board of directors, because it's a governance. It's governance over the company. Versus a scientific advisory board is they're the ones there giving technical advice. Your board members are there to give business advice, but the biggest business advice is, where can I find money? And so your early boards of directors tend to be overwhelmingly tied to fundraising and the ability to do more.
And our next question, I understand that investors do not like a case where two founders have 50-50 ownership, as this complicates decision making. Is this true?
Well, you have to distinguish ownership and decision making, right? So it depends on how it's set up. You can own 50-50 stock, but the way your company is set up, one of them can control. But aside from that, if an investor is going to invest, then once they invest, it's no longer 50-50.
Right, it's no longer 50-50. That's where I was.
So I don't think it's a big issue. But it's always dependent on the investor.
Yeah. Equal shares, I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, unless the investor looking at it says, I can tell that's unfair, and one of them's going to get pissed off, because I can tell by looking they're not actually doing 50-50. That's what might upset an investor. But by the time the investor invests, it's by definition not 50-50 anymore. And in fact, even a small investor is the controlling vote. Right, if they don't agree.
Yeah. So it actually puts an investor in a powerful position, because even if they get 10% of the company and the other two end up with 45-45, they're now the swing vote, as Lewis said. So it's probably not to your advantage to be equal, but I don't think the investors should care very much.
There's a follow-up question to that, and that is, can you invest in your own company beyond founders' stock or equity?
Yes. So a founder can also make cash investments. Typically, the founder's equity is done as common stock. And most investors are going to want preferred stock. Once you actually get to stock, once you're beyond safes and convertible notes, and the founder, like any other individual, can invest cash in the company additionally. And they do it largely to signal just how committed they are, because they're already got the upside via the common. So it's really more of I'm digging in my pocket too.
Yeah, and actually investors really like that. If you have what they call skin in the game, that you believe in your company and your invention enough that you're willing to put your own money in before you ask some investor for their money, that's something investors really, really find attractive.
Yes.
Excellent. Are there any suggestions on how to negotiate with tech transfer to prevent dilution or some dilution of a company that you're founding?
You can try. I'm doubtful that the university is going to agree to that. As Lewis said, the university has already invested in you, right? So they paid you a salary, they've supported your lab, they've done all these things, and if you start a company, they expect to get some percentage. That's always negotiable. As I said, there's the main thing the tech transfer offices want, in my experience, is to get their patent expenses recouped. And everything else is sort of gravy to them, because they know that most companies aren't going to succeed. So it's all a negotiation like everything else. But generally, universities will want some percentage of the company.
And typically, it's a small percentage that's not terribly suffocating, because otherwise, you're literally, you're drowning your own babies, and that doesn't make sense to them.
Yeah.
As long as they get their cash out of pockets covered, and they've got some sliver on the upside, it doesn't. I've
Yeah,
not seen greediness on the equity be the issue with
Yeah.
universities.
it's usually substantially less than 10%.
Yep.
But it's all negotiation.
Yeah.
And for our final question today, can you elaborate more on how founding scientists split equity into proportions considering past efforts? Is this time involved? What part of the science they created? Specifically, anything before the company was formed? Or should it be focused on work commitments to grow the company?
Exactly. So where I was I was rejecting the premise of the question until you got to the last phrase, because the work that led to it's important. It needs to be memorialized. It's the little part of the iceberg that's above the water. The hard work's the part below the water. It's the 9/10. It's really about the go forward. So, and that's not a bad analogy. 90% of it's about who's doing it going forward. And certainly the person quitting their academic job to lead this thing gets the lion's share. And if the others don't like it, they're welcome to quit too. Right? You want to do the work? Come on over. Oh, you want to keep your endowed chair and your benefits? Great. Those are two very different approaches. So it's not about the past contribution. It's about the go forward contribution and responsibility and kind of onus to get it done. Because otherwise it's just a good idea that was unfulfilled, that was unmonetized.
Excellent. So we have just 2 minutes left. And are there any final pearls of wisdom that you would offer our attendees to consider when they're curious about whether or not to form a company?
Sure. I think we'll circle back to Steve's point about, are you leaving science to go in sales? Are you so committed that this meets a market need? That and you've done the research necessary to understand that this is superior to the current standard of care, superior to other approaches. It's about market analysis. It's not about, oh, this is a nice, it's a novel receptor target. Well, so what? What does that mean in terms of market adoption?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. And just do your competitive analysis. Talk to who your end users are. NIH has the I-Core program. I would strongly suggest that anyone who wants to start a company look at the I-Core program, where they really take you through the training. And one of their big things is talk to the end users and make sure that what you think is an important need, especially for PhD scientists like me. I've talked to clinicians with my brilliant idea, and they just tell me why it would never work in the clinic. Get that kind of perspective. Really pressure test your idea before you start a company, and know that there's really a need for it, and that it's going to pass the reality test. I think is probably the best advice I could give.
Thank you both so much. Luis Gutierrez and Steve Wolpe, you have been tremendous. You have shared so much with the audience today. Really appreciate the time. And audience, participants, we appreciate your being here and the lively Q&A that we had going on. Have a wonderful remainder of your day.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.